No, any late items?
No, Mr. Chair, there are no late items.
Thank you. Then look for a motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Mayor McKay, second by Councilor Thorpe. Nothing? Call the question. All in favor? Thank you. Adoption of the minutes. Is there none? Yes, there is none.
No, there is none.
Presentations, there is none. And then we'll just get into it.
Excuse me. I have minutes.
You do?
Take 5 days.
I don't have minutes.
Oh. That's because I brought the wrong minute.
Okay.
Well, we can approve those if you're right.
Oops.
Are you doing a presentation first?
I am.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Victor, would you like to introduce the presentation? That's the best presentation introduction I've heard.
We'll be done in no time.
Yeah, we'll be done next time. It's all yours.
Before we get started, Mr. Chair, the minister's coming, and I gather food and refreshments are coming at 11:30, quarter to 12. So I was wondering if we could wrap up 11:30, quarter to 12.
We'll be done well.
We're going to be done by 10.
We're done by 10. Perfect.
Oh, sorry for the interruption.
Let me just see if I can get this working properly. There we go. Good morning. Today's presentation, I will provide some background on permissive tax exemptions. I'm going to talk about the different legislation that applies to statutory and permissive exemptions. I'm also going to refer to the city policy and guideline document. I'm going to provide some current statistics and also some of the background for what's going to make up the bylaw for the 2018 exemptions. Permissive tax exemptions provide an exemption for all property taxes, which includes the city taxes, school taxes, as well as taxes for the regional district and the hospital district, etc. The benefit is greater to the recipient than the cost to the city. An example of this is a business property assessed at $500,000 would pay approximately $6,900 in city taxes, but the total tax bill would be $11,500. And permissive tax exemptions are generally for non-profit organizations who provide services that benefit the greater community. The legislation for statutory exemptions is in the Community Charter, Section 220, and this is automatically applied by BC Assessment. These exemptions for government properties, for churches, for hospitals, and for schools, and as long as these properties are used for those purposes, they remain exempt. For permissive tax exemptions, it's Section 224 of the Community Charter. Municipal council may exempt properties. So this is discretionary up to council. The requirements are they must be a non-profit, charitable, or philanthropic organization, and the property must be used for a purpose directly related to the purpose of the organization. And this also applies to property beyond the building footprint of a church, as long as it's used for church purposes. Some other legislation, there's a general prohibition against assistance to a business or commercial enterprise. So we can't provide a permissive tax exemption to a business. And the permissive tax exemption bylaw must be adopted by October 31st of each year. And this allows the BC Assessment Authority the time to have the exemptions on the next assessment roll. The city has developed its own grants policy and guideline document, and a copy of this is in your agenda. There was a comprehensive review, policy review done back in 2011 that resulted in this policy document, and it primarily provides guidance for PTE, but it also provides guidance for some small grant amounts. And specifically, the policy says that the city will exempt up to 2 acres of the land surrounding a church building or a hospital building as well used for church or hospital purposes. They will exempt land and improvements operated as a private hospital or community care facility. And it will exempt property owned by a registered nonprofit organization maintained and used for public parks or public recreation purposes. The policy also says that council may exempt land and improvements held by nonprofit type organizations such as community service organizations, community associations, arts and cultural organizations, and other registered nonprofits. Some current statistics. The past 4 years, the average permissive tax exemptions average $1.5 million in municipal taxes. 2017, the estimate is expected to be $1.2 million because there were several organizations that became statutorily exempt during the year. The bylaw in 2017 represented 160 properties for 110 organizations. And the policy calls for a comprehensive review for organizations receiving permissive tax exemptions every 3 years. This review actually started in early 2017, but due to committee restructuring was deferred, and those applications are now set to be reviewed in early 2018, 3-year review. And for 2018 tax exemption bylaw, it will include the properties that were exempt in 2017, adjusted for any properties that were sold or where there were changes in use. And it will include any new applications that are approved to be added to the bylaw. And there are a total of 8 properties, applications for 8 properties from 5 applicants, that are follow further in this agenda. And I would be happy to accept any questions at the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Jerry and then Bill and then anybody else.
Thank you. So, can you go back one slide, please? Just. He wants to include to receive an exemption in 2017 adjusted for sold properties. What about the old hospital? That's my question. They're not there anymore. Are we taxing them now? Because they're not being used for what purpose it's being used for. So now they're going to put it on the market. So are they getting a tax exemption until they sell
I
it?
don't think it was though, right? Because it was
It was tax exemption.
was it?
Perhaps we can
Senior
just,
care? Oh, sorry.
let's allow.
Is it senior, you're talking about the property that was used for
Yeah, on
the
the top
seniors?
hill.
Yeah. BC Assessment would look at when that property was sold, or...
It's not sold yet.
It's not sold
But
yet?
it's not being
Yeah.
used as a care facility anymore because we moved them to 10th Street. That's my question.
So I think that's a good question, and perhaps if Victor or staff could look into what the status of its exemption may or may not be moving forward. Would that be a reasonable request?
Yeah, through the chair, when a property changes use, BC Assessment is usually advised of the change in use, and then they would adjust the exemption. So if the property is no longer being used for its purpose, then it no longer qualifies for a permissive tax exemption. If it was permissively exempt, if it's statutorily exempt, it would be the same.
Oh, I thought so it's not us that tells them.
So it would be-
It seems like we're telling them.
If it's permissively exempt, we would tell them that the use has changed, and then they would lose the exemption for the next year.
So are we telling them? That's the question, I guess.
Yes.
So we'll do a follow-up.
Yeah.
Because these are date-dependent changes.
Agreed.
So we'll make that follow-up, and if indeed they have changed, we'll obviously have to adapt. If it's permissive, that means it's for our purposes. We say, well, we're not doing this. If it's statutory, then BC Assessment through the reporting system would make that up.
Okay, thank you.
So I think it's a really good question, and you'll follow up with a response. Thank you. Bill?
I've got a number of questions. One is similar to that one, and that is council granted permissive tax exemptions on 2 properties for travelers. One was being used. We granted exemption on that one. Then we granted exemption prior to the construction of Eden Gardens. So how can we grant a single owner 2 properties, permissive tax exemption for 2 properties? One that's being used for its intended purpose, the other one that's not.
Through the chair, if I recall correctly, is that the Northfield property?
That's correct.
Okay,
Eden
yes,
Gardens.
yeah. And it went to the Grants Advisory Committee. They had requested a permissive tax exemption on the property while it was being constructed. And through consultation with BC Assessment and then back to the Grants Advisory Committee, they recommended to council that property be given a tax exemption while it was being constructed. as it was going to be used, it was being constructed for that purpose.
Right.
And it was approved, and therefore they then received, and became exempt the next year.
So the day that they take occupancy of that building, then the other one should lose its exemption, should it not?
If it's no longer being used for that purpose, then yes, it's pretty much
You
similar
put
to.
that one on the list as
that's
well?
one.
Yeah. The other one is nonprofits versus for-profits. So in that particular case, there was 100, the reason for building the new facility was because it was, the old facility was no longer fit in order to meet the guidelines for care. And there was 140 new beds that were being approved by Island Health for funding. So there was a for-profit company at the north end, Nanaimo Seniors, under Retirement Concepts, that were bidding on that. For funded beds, would that property have been exempt, or would it not have been exempt?
The company owning.
If they'd been successful?
Yeah, the company owning and operating the property would have to be nonprofit. That's one of the requirements. So if it's a for-profit that's running a facility, then that would exclude them from a PTE.
So that would then, so we hear a lot from commercial operators of everything from waste to retirement homes, that the not-for-profits have an automatic, due to this tax exemption, significant advantage over the for-profits. Because if Retirement Concepts can't bid on it because the other guys are getting a significant property tax exemption, that creates a problem. That creates an unlevel playing field. How do we address that?
So, yes, there is, I think, some inherent disadvantages for some. And you always run into gray areas where you say there is a for-profit group doing good work that deserve, that deserve help, public help. But then if you peel back the onions, the real purpose of doing that good work was not to do the good work. The real purpose was to make a profit. And so legislation obviously can't be all-encompassing, catch-all. They try to take the middle of the road. You will have all these somewhat gray areas where it becomes a little bit of a challenge. Even the statutory ones, right? So somebody would say there is a church, and so that's religion. So are we now publicly funding religion when all of us are not religious? We have to settle that. Or there is a church, there is a little bit of commercial work going on around churches. Most of them have done that because they need to survive financially. And so you run into those things where you try and peel back the onions and try and make the distinctions. But yes, you're right. The playing field is never.
So if I could, then that would make Jerry's question moot, because that property, if it's a for-profit company, Chartwell, they wouldn't have received tax exemption on that property.
But to that same point, what we're saying is, when you take one and focus your attention to it and try and understand what's going on there, there is very gray areas that are really beyond for-profit, non-profit, and that kind of stuff. And as she's saying, there's a back and forth between us and the assessment authority just to try and understand some of these nuances.
So if I could, Mr. Chair, rental of properties in commercial operations on exempt properties. So if I've got this correct, it's the Alliance, what's the church at Boundary in Meredith? Alliance. So the Alliance Church would be statutorily exempt for the building footprint.
Correct.
Then they have a parking lot, which is permissive, which we grant. And they have a business, which is renting parking spaces to people at the hospital. So, again, we've given them an exemption on that for what's essentially a commercial enterprise.
Through the chair, if that's the case, and they're actually, because I've seen for some churches, some organizations that we give exemptions to, they have a small business component of it, and the assessment authority will look at what that commercial part is in the property, and they'll make that taxable. So like for a Legion, a lot of times it's the bar, the bar in the clubhouse area. For churches, if they are running a business, they will look at what's being used for that. So I wasn't aware that somebody's renting parking space, but I could certainly follow up with, on that church to see, and follow up with BC Assessment if that's the case, to see if they are showing part of that property is being used for business and therefore taxable.
So my last question, Mr. Chair, is when we grant a PTE or it's statutorily exempt, is there a trigger that causes rise to other taxes not being due? In other words, there's no folio created.
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Well, no
Yeah.
folio created for that property, in other words, at BC Assessment.
If a property is not taxable? I don't understand your question.
Well, there are certain, it's my understanding that the provincial government has agreement with certain organizations, and I'll be specific, the Island Corridor, where nothing is due upon, when we grant a PTE, nothing is due. No school taxes, no hospital taxes, no nothing.
That is correct.
How is that different from others? Because when we grant exemptions, does it become blanket then, or it's just city taxes?
For the Island Corridor Foundation, they have a permissive tax exemption,
Right.
so it is all taxes.
Thank you.
So I have Cheryl and then Ian.
I just want to take the one that we're going to actually be going for, unless you want me to wait till that time, Mr. Chair, on the literacy.
Let's just allow everybody to have questions for the presenter. We'll accept the presenter and then we'll deal with
Yeah,
the.
because I just wanted to know the difference, like when you're talking about for profit basis, like on one that we're going to be going, there is profit basis things that will do that, but they charge and these people don't charge, so is that a issue or not? Because otherwise, like, I'll wait, never mind, I'll
Okay.
wait. Are you going to still be here?
Just wait, sure.
Yes.
Thanks. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
That's why these are really good meetings, because you get to ask questions like
Yeah.
this and it's casual, it's a little
Yeah.
less.
I'll ask it at the proper time.
Ian.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think relating to several of the comments, because I did chair the Grants Advisory Committee, as Diane well knows, and yeah, maybe the playing field is never exactly level, but I just need to point out that the application form for all of these organizations got revised within the past 2 years, and I think is a very exhaustive form, which does ask the organization to identify what it's providing in terms of service, how many volunteers are involved, what income it's deriving from various sources, what other income it's getting from other sources. And I think all of those factors are taken into account, or have been taken into account, when the committee in past looked at whether or not an organization deserved an exemption. And it comes down to, as Mr. Mema said, peeling things back a little bit and asking what good are they doing to the community to warrant this exemption. So there may be some element of profit to a group. In most cases there's not, but in some there may be. But they still may be warranting some help. Thank you.
Thank you. Jerry?
Thank you. Just to follow up with Ian's and the mayor's comments. With our housing strategy, I like to change the PTEs, the for-profits could benefit. If we're talking about housing shortages and we need rental, why are we forcing them to become a non-profit if we can still set the rates on affordable housing? Yeah, I know it's a big spectrum, won't go there, but with rental, if they're willing to subsidize rent based on what we provide and the amounts that we set, why can't a for-profit get a tax exemption to provide affordable housing? Like, we're giving it, all these are all housing that's, I get it, the only source of income is housing. They're competing against, well, we talk about private and public, and well, how do we expect the private guys to do this when they don't want to because there's no incentive for them to do it, so nonprofits pop up to do it. So I don't know, when we get to that discussion, why can't we set the rent and say, well, these affordable housing people are charging this much for rent. If you're a private person and you want to charge this much too, we'll give you a tax exemption. Is that possible to do?
I see Victor's hand up. I think,
I know that's
I think it's
provincial.
I think we're off the subject matter a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it would be, I mean, the whole affordable housing conversation, I
Yeah.
think it's a much larger
Agreed, but this will be a part of it.
that this may form a portion of it if you wish, but.
I agree with the chair. All I was going to say is you have two venues where this will be addressed.
Yeah.
You have the conversation that you're going to have about affordable housing strategies. And you also, next year, we're committing to revisit this whole piece again, like we did in 2011, I think. So at that point, I think we'll have an even more fulsome discussion just to re-understand where these things go. Yes, you have some leeway on the permissive side, but it's not 100%, right? So when you're talking about for-profit, non-profit, then you get into, how are they registered and that kind of stuff. Where does the money end up at the end of the day, that kind of stuff. So it's a layer of review that goes through, as Councillor Rob said, that at the end of the day you say, on the balances of what's going on here, really the motive is to do these good things. On the balance of all the evidence, the motive is to make a profit. So you make that call. So we will have that conversation, I think, at those two venues, and we can understand.
Bill, Diane, you're the only person that hasn't had anything, so I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to.
So on that note, I mean, can we not use another vehicle that's at our disposal, such as what we did with the hotels, where you grant a 5 or 10-year exemption? But again, I'm confused because on the hotel on Gordon Street, I thought I was always told that any tax exemption would only go to the city taxes, not the other taxes. Am I wrong on that?
You're absolutely correct. See,
Is that part of the bylaw?
that's part of the bylaw.
Okay.
And in any case, what you're doing here is you are, as a city, say we are foregoing this so we can incentivize this.
Right.
So yeah, you picked a good tool. You could use that for affordable housing. But what you have to understand, though, at the end of the day, is tax exemptions are expenditures in and themselves. So you are actually foregoing. So when you're foregoing that revenue, you also want to balance that with what's the return to the city.
So I could follow up with respect to the housing one. In Saskatoon, for those of us that were there, when they gave us the tour of their program, for rental properties, they would give the landlord a 5-year tax exemption on the property that would incentivize them to build the project. On the sale units, they would give the homeowners a 5% incentive for the down payment, and they would make them pay taxes because they didn't want them to find themselves in the situation as in the US where 5 years later all of a sudden you've got this big bill to pay. They would pay it from the beginning, and they diverted those funds back to the funding program in order to continue to pay that. But I also wanted to just comment on Councillor Thorpe's suggestion with respect to the profit non-profits. So if we look at travelers as an example, where we've given them exemption on 2, we look at other organizations where we look at the greater good, then let's all remember that when we get into discussion with commercial operators with respect to any subsidies or forgiveness to the NRE. We do it all over the place, and it's our discretion. And if it's for the greater good, then we need to defend that, so should we so choose to grant any exemptions to the NRE.
Because the chair asked me a question, so the NRE does receive a PTE of about $10,000, and I'll let Diane explain that piece, how that works, because it's going to be in front of you in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Then I know.
So I'm sorry, just before you So you're satisfied, and then we're just going to shift gears to the NRE subject matter as it relates to permissive tax exemptions? Is that what?
Through the chair, the Nanaimo Recycling Exchange has been receiving a permissive tax exemption for several years. They have a piece of property that they own, and then there is a piece of property that they lease that they are currently operating out of. They have been granted a permissive tax exemption on a year-to-year basis for the property that they own, with the plan for them to transition over to that piece of property. I believe that's the property that Toyota has used for spare parking for a while. So they've had ongoing plans to move their operation over to that piece of property, and it's been delayed for various reasons. But my understanding is March 2018 they have to be out. Toyota's informed them that they can no longer occupy the space that they have. So the PT has been granted. 2017 was approximately $10,000. So it's the owner of the property that gets the PTE, and then they pass that benefit on to the company that's leasing.
Thank you.
If I could just clarify, so they're currently on a piece of property that they pay rent on, that they also pay taxes on. The property they
Yes,
own
that
that's
is correct.
occupied is the one they get the PTE on.
It's the property that they own they get the PTE on the property that they own. The property that they occupy, they would be paying taxes on to
So why did we handle travelers different? We gave them tax exemption on both properties, one they occupied and operated out of versus the other.
So, Mr. Chair, I think,
So the property that they own is vacant, and they received a $10,000 2017 PTE, which is applied against, what I thought I heard you say, which is applied to the benefit against the piece of property that they're leasing. Did I hear that right?
Yes, they're getting a PTE on the property that they lease.
So they are in fact getting a lease or a benefit. So they own the chunk of dirt that's vacant. They're leasing from Toyota. They get $10,000 PTE against this applied to the piece that they're leasing. That's how I just understood the explanation.
I don't remember.
What does that mean in relation to the travelers? I don't know, but I feel as though that we're probably going to have this conversation at a future point as it relates to the specifics of NRE. I think this is a great time to have that conversation, but maybe we can deal with what's here, and then if we want to continue that conversation coming back, that would be great. I don't know if that satisfies.
Right, this isn't about NRE, this is the application of our rules for our grants. I see something very different there.
Fair enough, and I'm just asking if staff, maybe we can have that conversation.
And maybe they just never applied.
Exactly.
So if I may, Chair, and I totally agree that we should deal with what's on our agenda, but if I may make my final comment on this, I don't recall what happened with travelers as part of that committee. I do recall what happened with NRE because it was a very special circumstance, and we had NRE come and present to us to justify. We debated, and in fact, instead of giving them a 3-year exemption, we extended year by year because they kept thinking they were going to be moving. We did feel on balance they were worthy of an exemption, and so it was granted on a year-by-year basis. So I can only speak to that. I don't recall discussions about the other situation.
Thanks for that, and I just think it's important that because we are being questioned that we don't do anything for NRA or whatever. I just have a couple questions if I may. We don't have to provide a 100% permissive tax exemption. Is it at our discretion if we wish to do a 40 or 50 or an 80 or whatever percent of whatever it might be?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. And do we have any in our 110 or however many we have that are a percentage that's less than 100?
The permissive tax exemptions we're currently giving are 100% of the property that's occupied.
But we do have the discretionary powers to give 50 or...
Yes, you certainly can provide any level of exemption.
Thank you. And you mentioned parking lots, and my recollection on some of our churches, for example, where you indicate that there is a commercial use or a revenue income generated, we have some places that are red line, and so not 100% of their property is permissive tax exempted, maybe 60% of their property is tax exempt, or whatever the number might be.
Yes.
And so we have that discretionary power as well.
We can do that, yes, we can. Typically, the assessment authority will determine what the taxable value of the property is, and they'll make that not exempt. So they'll make that taxable, and they get an exemption on the rest of it. So that'll be done through the assessment authority.
Okay, thank you. And then my last comment would be when we're talking about comparators, so coming up Brecon Hill, and there's the church, and then there's a development proposed. I know it's not there yet, but assumedly that entire property is receiving permissive tax exemption. So similar to the old hospital or any of the other travelers, is it reasonable to assume that if there's a development, rental, or purchase or commercial on that site, then all things on that site would change in terms of its exemption?
BC assessment would change the classification of the property, especially with the rental property, I would expect. And there would have to be a determination of what is exempt or not. Again, when buildings or when properties are under construction, they typically don't get a PTE. That was with the property in Northfield that council granted. That was more of an exception. It does qualify under the legislation. As long as it was being built for the purpose, it was determined that it could be considered being used for the purpose. But that was, in my experience, that was not typical of what we would do. Usually property under development is not until it's actually got occupancy that we give a PTE. So just some clarification on the Northfield property. As far as what's going to happen with the church on Brecon, I'd have to work with BC Assessment Authority on that and then bring that information back to the committee.
So in other words, there's not one size fits all, or because the Brecon site will be different than the Northfield site in so much as what is being built on and for what purpose, but the church will remain. So, thank you. That's all the questions that I have. Is there any other questions or comments or thoughts? There being none, a motion to receive the presentation to the presenter. Moved by Phil, second by Ian. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Alrighty, so now we'll just move into the consideration of the new permissive tax exemptions. And Victor, is it necessary for you? Would you like to introduce this for us, or do you want to just?
No, I think we would, what I would suggest probably is you could, if you have questions on the applications, just go application by application, and then either vote on each one of them, or go through all of them, questions, and then come back.
Okay, so thank you very much. So what I'd like to do then is if we can get a motion on the floor, please, and then we can. Okay, go ahead.
So, if we're gonna do them, can I make all of these motions and then do it like as one and then vote on them seriatim? Is that the way you
If you make the
prefer it?
recommendation, and then we can do one, which is different than two,
Yeah.
and then do three, which is different than 1 and 2. So
Okay.
that would be helpful.
All right, then, where is it? That I move that the Finance and Audit Committee recommend that council award a permissive tax exemption for the 2018 tax year to the Nanaimo Literacy Association for property it leases at 19 Commercial Street.
Second by Jared. Yes, Jared.
Can you please change that word to award? It seems like they're getting an award for something. I'd rather see approve or grant, because it's not an award. Sorry. It's just not an award.
That's an easy one.
Yeah, because I don't want it to sound like they're getting an award for something.
So you just wish it to say
Approved or grant, something different than an award.
I think it's just the manner in which you.
I know, but it sounds like an award.
Yeah, fair enough.
No.
So if there's no, it's the.
There's no problem, that's fine, approve.
Yeah.
Approve a permissive tax exemption.
Thank you. And we don't need to do anything about that in terms of having the motion. Bill and then Ian.
So I just wanted to ask the question, all of these ones that we have listed in front of us, have those all, are we at the point where they've simply applied? Or have their applications been reviewed and they are all eligible for exemptions?
So staff have done their review, they are eligible, but that decision of approving lies with.
So if they've applied and their applications have been reviewed by staff and they're all eligible, I don't know why we're doing them one at a time.
But that's a process, but you guys are the governors.
Only because they're numbered independent of one another. If you'd like to, if the mover and the seconder would like to change that to do all on one fell swoop, that's fine too. I don't have any objection to either way.
Well, I mean,
Absolutely.
I think it would be most efficient to have all of them at one time. And then if someone wanted to pull one out to vote separately, then that would be appropriate. Otherwise, we may go through the exact same process with each one.
So I'm
All right,
I'm impartial. It
okay,
makes
so
no
I
difference.
would move all of them.
Is there not a motion?
So just,
Well,
so if we can just amend, we can
Yes,
And, yeah.
just,
friendly amendment, all of them. How's that?
and that is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's one on the front page. There's 5. So then we'll just call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. All right, so all 5 are on the table. Sure. Oh, sorry.
You just approved it all. No, you just voted.
No, we just approved to do them all at
Same time.
once.
Same time.
As opposed to seriatim.
I thought that was a friendly amendment.
Well, it was a friendly
Nevertheless,
amendment.
it's clear now it was. It's been approved as an
I didn't think we were-
amendment, so-
I thought we were voting on them all, actually.
Well, sure, and I'm
No, I have a
impartial.
question on the one.
Okay, that's fine.
I do have a question on the literacy.
Sorry, it's how you were voted.
Well, it's over. Go ahead.
You gotta be quicker
Just
than
my
that.
question is, when we look at the exemptions that aren't given to services that are otherwise provided for a private or for profit basis, that's being literacy Central Vancouver Island, because what about like something like Sylvan Learning and stuff? Is that, am I drawing too far a reach?
I think therefore,
Yeah.
This is not the Literacy Association?
no.
No, that's what I'm saying. It says exemptions aren't given to services that are otherwise provided on a private for profit basis. Sylvan does provide that service. That's my question for profit.
Where are you?
And when you look at your sheet, it says exemptions
What
not
page you
given
on?
to services.
Page?
Oh, the very first one, unless I'm reading it wrong. 15. See, I could be reading this wrong, because the way I read this, that if there's a private business that's doing the same thing, then we shouldn't be looking at necessarily giving a nonprofit that, or am I reading that wrong?
No, that, through the chair, that is correct, that, so in order to not compete with private industry, but I think it goes down to the services provided by the Nanaimo Literacy and services provided by a for-profit group, and I don't know if they're apples and apples in this situation.
That's what I'm saying, like I'm probably drawing like too much into it, right? That was my question, because Sylvan provides the exact same services.
I'm not.
Yeah, they go to adults, they go to learners, they have tutoring programs, they have all that stuff. But the difference is, and this is where, is that I think the majority of people that literacy serves can't afford it.
It's a different one.
So would that be fair to put it in that
That's
context?
exactly what the point is.
Okay.
So,
Okay, I'm good. You don't have to explain it, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Ian, I think you were actually before.
No, I didn't have.
I jumped the gun.
That's okay. No, I didn't.
All right, is there any other questions? Then I will call the question. Here we go, Jerry. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Is there a move? Because we don't, no, we don't have it on the floor yet as a motion. I
thought we did.
No, our motion was essentially to defeat the motion to do one at a time. Then we made a motion to do all 5, which we approved.
Right.
At the same time, and then we haven't got a motion on the floor to, or do we? I don't know. Do we have a
We do.
motion?
Staff.
We amended it, it started with 1, then it went to all 5.
So we have a motion on the floor. All in favor? Yay. All right, carried. We're so excited about it, we passed it.
We're done 15 minutes earlier than you thought.
Wait a minute.
Now, did anybody want to have any, just because with so many of us here, did anybody want to have any casual conversation? We can adjourn, I guess we should adjourn.
Other business?
Other business, is there other business? Let's talk about other business before we adjourn that.
So before you leave this subject, just for the process, just remember that what you just approved are just for 1 year.
Yeah.
Next year, we're going to review all of them, and we'll try and go back to the 3-year cycle, if that's where council ends. We'll take all the questions you've asked in terms of, is it 100%, is it 50%, is it, we'll look at what others do, and put that in front of you so that you can have that conversation. We'll try and do this early enough before people begin to apply, at least to get the policy review side done early, so when people apply, we have all that in place. That's what I needed to put in place.
Great, thanks, Victor. Ian?
Thanks, Chair, and I'll just make the comment that this every 3-year review is a very exhaustive process. And I believe that the core review made a recommendation that we consider doing it every 5 years instead. So that's just something that's out there that we might want to keep in the back of our minds. Thank you.
Good point. And is it fair to assume too that all of them don't come up at the same time? So not all of them would be being reviewed. If you haven't been in the queue for 3 years, you wouldn't be being reviewed if it's done every 3 years.
Yeah, it's fair to make that assumption because at the end of the day, there are some that you already know, unless something catastrophic happens, they would get the exemption, and so you kind of like take them through the fire once and wait for any changes, and then changes are handled through a well-known criteria and process. So we'll take a look and see what's in the pile and what comes in front of you. But all it means is at times, some files you'll spend more time on than others. So that's all.
It's ongoing. Yes.
Just to clarify though, the review does review all of the organizations that receive the PTE once every 3 years currently. So the 110 organizations that were on the PTE bylaw this year, it would be 110 applications that the committee would be looking at once every 3 years. So it is quite the onerous process, as Councillor Rogers stated.
And all of these ones that we just approved have gone through the grants advisory, these new ones,
No, just staff.
just that, okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's not solve next year. Sorry. Go ahead.
Just to what I forgot Diane was saying is any that are added go on for that space in time until the next review of them all. They don't start 3 years.
That's right. Sure.
I just want to thank you, Diane, because that was really good, especially for me that's new to the process. Your hints were really good, and following that was easy, so thank you.
Go.
So I think we got some good examples this morning about profit versus nonprofit. Literacy Nanaimo example, literacy versus Sylvan. We don't grant exemption to a commercial operator, but we do a nonprofit. Granted, their clients are different. Nanaimo Seniors Village versus Travelers, we did things differently for them. So I can't emphasize enough when we start getting lobbied by the waste and recyclers that there is a greater good involved with NRE, and that we bear that in mind. Victor, when they put pressure on us.
And the example that Councillor Armstrong brought actually makes it easy to explain.
Right.
So where there is private competition for that product, you then flip back into pricing and say, well, so if Victor is saying he's not for profit and he's charging the same price that Jerry is charging, which is for profit, which is the market rate, then Victor loses because now we know what his motive is, right? So those are the difficult things. Once you get into reviewing these, where you can kind of like take it, one layer at a time, to really get to what's the motive of providing this. So when you get into pricing, usually you say, well, what's the market charging? So we are now for the public good, subsidizing for the public good, because otherwise there is a certain sector of the society that may not access literacy because it's not affordable. And we are agreeing that it's for the greater good of Nanaimo that service is provided.
And I appreciate that. I think also when we have the scale of percentages that we would be out, because perhaps not the entirety of business is representative of the greater good of the community. They're competing with private, and private's competing with them, but here's some places where they don't. And this isn't the greater good of the community because, quote unquote, nobody else is doing it. So maybe that's 10% of the business, or 20, or 100. Who knows? I don't know until you start to really peel it back, as you say. I have Diane and then Jerry.
I don't know much about the senior stuff, but I mean the rate is set by the province, and they either accept the beds as subsidized or not. I don't think that. I'm not aware of a rule that says every senior's residence has to accept subsidized beds. I'm not aware of that. It could well be.
No, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, so that would then surprise me that we would want to grant permissive tax exemption to them. And with regard to affordable housing and permissive tax exemptions to incent them, it seems to me that, as Victor said, a permissive tax exemption is an expenditure. So if we were wondering how we might incent people or builders to have some affordable units, I think that during the process of working with that developer, we would start to talk about the advantages of bringing in some affordable housing into their buildings. So maybe we would say, we want you to have 5 suites, we'll do this for you. In fact, maybe we'll pay you the same amount as you might have got on a permissive tax exemption. I mean, there's all sorts of ways of going around this. I don't believe permissive tax exemptions for for-profit organizations is the route to take on this, because I think it muddies the purpose. But we certainly have the authority to subsidize those. We have lots of authority to go to UBCM and ask for that body to get behind us on developing plans for having the province help us subsidize individual suites in buildings. There's all sorts of methods, and so I personally would rather not see a permissive tax exemption used, but instead use other incentives that we're in control of, that we have the authority to do.
Thanks, Ed. Really good point. I mean, with the downtown, that's what we did downtown. So we had basically
DCC.
well, DCCs, but also if you spent $1 million on a reno and
Yeah.
spent all those things. So that was a homegrown. That was an organic homegrown thing that we did. We reduced industrial taxes because we wanted to attract business. So we bumped up residential or whatever we did, and we knocked down industrial. Now I'm hoping that we're going to start revisiting our industrial tax base.
You know, I think that one of the good things about UBCM is the strong lobby that they represent to the province. And if we wanted to do something like that, I'd like to see us talk to the province about partnering with them, because they used to purchase units in the city as low income, like maybe 10 or so in the 80s they had that. So certainly there's no reason why we couldn't talk to them about partnering with the money to make that happen, to incent developers.
You'll be here at noon. You'll be here at noon.
Well, she's the health minister, but
No, mental health
Well,
and
okay,
addiction.
sorry. Sorry.
No, it's not. Adrian Dix is the health.
Yeah, you're
No,
right.
I mean
I'm
this
sorry.
person.
That's all right.
But sure, we can talk to her about housing.
But doesn't the province provide to the city of Nanaimo somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 million of cooperative housing benefit. I think it was 6 something, so I'm just estimating that it's increased.
But it's not sufficient, as we discussed.
I'm not
So,
saying
yeah.
that it is or it isn't, I just.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, here's an opportunity, and Jerry's right, we could mention to her that we would like more housing for mental health and addictions, more supported housing, we're looking to the province to help us with that. And just a comment too, that's all.
Any other comments? Sure.
I forgot to ask, how much did we lose in property taxes with the 5?
Sorry?
How much did we lose with the ones that just the ones we approved?
Oh,
Yes, it's 1.5 overall.
It's 8, well, it's 1.5, and it's 1.2 for 2017.
Yeah.
And I don't know what these ones are, it's probably about 100 grand, probably.
Give me a second, I can.
Was it in there? I didn't.
On each of the cover pages, there's, it says current year taxes if no.
Oh, okay.
For each of the applications. So there was one, the non-literacy, the current value of the taxes there was just under $9,500. The rest of them, the tax amount is noted on that cover sheet.
All right, find that, thank you.
Cheryl, and then we're gonna wrap up.
Is everybody staying here for the minister?
No.
No?
It's 2 hours, isn't it?
No, but I don't mean here, but I mean, are you coming for the meeting with
I
her?
am.
Like, could we maybe make a plan after how to deal with such a short time for questions?
Sure.
Before, like, after everybody's done, just so that we don't waste time? Thanks.
So if I could, on another note, the Brecken, I'm really interested to see what their approach is going to be, whether they're going to be offering market rates for that property. I would certainly consider exemption if it was non-market.
They say they're not non-market.
It's not non-market, or it is non-market?
That's what their rate was.
Well, we gave them an exemption to go 6 stories.
Yeah.
From 2 to 4, which is already zoned for. Now we've given them the zoning benefit to go to 6 for
Low income.
Yep.
So,
I'm in a
but
meeting.
I mean, I think we're gonna get there. Like, we're gonna find out if they're still 100% permissive tax exemption because there's still a church there, or they're not. And the BC assessment will tell us what they qualify for or don't qualify for. Would that be correct?
No, that's correct.
If the use has changed.
They'll look at the different, because part of that will now become class 1 residential property versus, I think, church properties classified under recreational, not residential. So there'd be different property classes and there may be different, whether it's statutory exempt or could be permissively exempt. They would have to apply for, say, the residential area to be exempt. I'm thinking that's permissive, not statutory. So that would be a new application.
So I just know myself that if it was market rents, then I wouldn't be in favor of any permissive tax exemption for that portion of the property or the building that's being rented. If it's non-market rents, and they can show that, then that might change my view. I just wanted to ask Councillor Armstrong if she's familiar with PILTs.
No.
Does anybody have any desire or perhaps a sidebar with Councillor Armstrong with finance? Payments in lieu of taxes?
But I can
We have very few
go meet
properties
after.
that provide us that, but we certainly have increased bills forever. And if we're gonna have any, I don't disagree with having that conversation, but I would certainly like to put all the properties that are bills related,
Like,
which we know which they are, and then say when was the last time we ever increased their percentages.
But let's understand what's going on with payments. The payments in lieu of taxes, they are almost like voluntary. They are not being required to pay. They say we're paying because we could have been paying this. And so it's kind of like, it's not a negotiation. I think it's like a partnership with these groups. So it's not like you can sit and say, well, you're supposed to pay us $10. We know you're exempt from paying, and you're paying because you're a good citizen. Maybe you should just pay us the 100%. You can have that conversation, but it's almost like a partnership, kind of like conversation. It's not like you saying to Victor, you owe us $10 for taxes.
I guess all I was looking for, Victor, was an understanding. This discussion we're having today is properties that do not pay taxes.
Yeah.
So that, to me, just seems like a reasonable extension of that conversation. Properties that do not pay taxes.
They pay taxes except that you decide to spend the taxes on your programs.
Well, they provide a payment instead of taxes.
Yes.
Yeah. And it was a reason.
It's just called something different.
Yeah.
But is it,
But they're not required to pay.
Right.
but they do, but is it an equal amount or?
No.
But that could be the conversation. I mean, that could be a conversation. If they are partners, we should be able to sit at the table and have a conversation and say, hey, guys,
Right.
here's what we're thinking, what are you thinking?
I was just hoping that Councillor Armstrong could have a sidebar with finance staff to understand what PILTs are. That's all.
No, I will.
And how they work.
I'll hook it up with Victor for when it's convenient for staff and go with.
Okay, we said we're gonna be done at 10. It's 1 minute to 10. Diane, you're last.
1 minute, okay. Way back, what, in the 80s, the BC Ferries wasn't paying taxes, and they weren't required to, so we shut off all of the water, et cetera, to the, I mean, there are sometimes leverage. We don't have the authority to make them pay taxes, but we might have the leverage to convince them to pay some taxes.
I couldn't imagine anybody that's paying pills now saying,
No.
sorry guys, we're out.
Oh, I get that, but I think they may well say, sorry guys,
We're not paying anymore."
that's all we're
Well,
paying.
and that's fine, but I can't
I actually
imagine
don't
anybody
think they
saying we're
would
going
say
down.
that, except BC Ferries.
All right, motion adjourned. Done. All voted on.
Thank you.
Carried.